I do know that for many, many young couples, that they would like to have a child or like to have a child earlier or like to have an additional child. And they do the calculation and say, we just can't afford that. And as a nation, we can't afford them not having kids.
That was U.S. Senator Mitt Romney on the Freakonomics podcast last fall. Is it in society's best interest to make parenthood convenient and affordable?
When elected officials don't understand we're in overshoot and more people is the exact opposite of what we need, who are you going to call?
Calling. Call the growth buster. Whoa.
You've landed on the Growth Busters podcast, where we hold your hand as you come to terms with limits to growth. We have outgrown the planet. We've hit the limits and gone beyond. That rubber band is going to snap back, and we'd best figure out how to shrink the scale of the human enterprise before Mother Nature does it for us. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and founder and senior fellow here at the Center for Busting Pro-Growth Mythology.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, Growth Busters board member, environmental law and policy wonk, and sustainable energy nerd. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org.
Two quick things before we get to the main subject of this episode. Thing one, if you're interested in a part-time job helping us manage the Growth Busters network and helping us with a new outreach project on college campuses, write to us right away. podcast@growthbusters.org.
And the other thing is we want to dive into the feedback from you guys, our listeners.
Yeah, we got some really good stuff this time.
Yeah, we've got some great stuff, but we're going to save that for the end of the episode this time. So stick around. After the meat of the episode today, we will turn to that listener feedback. Now let's get to the main topic of this episode.
I think some expertise in ethics will be valuable in this conversation, Stephanie. So I invited Dr. Philip Cafaro to join us. Phil is professor of philosophy at Colorado State University and an affiliated faculty member of CSU's School of Global Environmental Sustainability. As it happens, he's written a couple of books about human overpopulation, and he is co-founder of the Overpopulation Project. I'm going to put a link in the show notes because you want to be on their email list and you want to explore that website. In fact, Phil, right off the bat, I want to give you a chance for people who are just learning about you. Tell us just real quickly a little bit about the Overpopulation Project.
Sure. And Dave, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you and Stephanie today. Yeah, the Overpopulation Project is a research and activism project that I started 4 years ago with a Swedish ecologist, Frank Gottmark. And Jane O'Sullivan from Australia subsequently joined us. And our goal is simply to explore the environmental impacts of overpopulation and to help people who are arguing for ways to address overpopulation. So we're a small group, but we put out new research and connect people around the world who are interested in population issues.
Very impressive work. So we'll definitely put a shink in the low notes or a link in the show notes. Okay, well, let's get right to the topic at hand. Does society have an obligation to make parenthood possible, practical, convenient, and or affordable to all? And what made me think of that question was the conversations that are happening in the U.S. right now about some public policy enhancements. But before we get into those and that question, what do we know? We know for sure that we're in overshoot, which means that we are demanding more of the planet than the planet can sustainably provide for us in the long haul. We know that we cannot get out of overshoot by addressing only the size of our economy or the size of our population. Why? Because we are so deep into overshoot that we have got to address both of those. Those are the main multipliers. And so we know that contracting population is an essential part of allowing this civilization to persist. I would think that all three of us agree on those points.
Yes,
Count me in.
Agree. Yeah, agree with all of that.
That's kind of elementary for the people here in the room, but who knows, we might have some people who are new to this concept. So let's assume that with that knowledge that we can somehow get past the growth addiction and Ponzi demography that today is driving a lot of public policy intended to increase birth rates. That's just all about we need more people. If we can get past that Ponzi demography stuff, then it follows that public policy shouldn't incentivize procreation or send any signals that procreation is a societal goal, it seems to me. In the U.S., a more discussed motive for these pronatal public policies is avoiding child poverty, in a sense that it's just too challenging to have and raise children. And for some reason, that is unfair. For some, like U.S. Senator Mitt Romney, it's also about depopulation panic. Romney proposed his Family Security Act, which was $250 for every school-aged child and $350 for every younger child per month for families earning up to $400,000 a year. And we listened to a little bit of this at the very beginning of this episode, but I want to share one more little clip of Senator Romney, something that he told Stephen Dubner in a recent episode of the Freakonomics podcast.
What I found is that families are having a hard time, and many would like to have children or have more children, but they feel they can't afford kids. Our population is declining pretty substantially. We're down, I think, 5.8 million people from where we would have been had we maintained the birth rate of the last decade. So we got some work to do.
So I think that kind of demonstrates an attitude that we have out there, a kind of a misinformed attitude about this, kind of blindly and mindlessly thinking that we owe it to everybody to make it possible for them to have as many kids as they want. And we'll talk about that, I think. But also, I think Senator Romney here intentionally tries to mislead us when he said our population is declining pretty substantially. Is our population declining, Phil?
No, our population's growing. In fact, over the past 10 years, according to the Census Bureau, we've grown by 21 million, something like that.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S.
Yeah.
So pretty clearly, you see these kinds of worries. If we're not growing as much or more than we were in the past, immediately we're declining. It's just not accurate.
Yeah. Well, he's unhappy that the rate of growth is declining.
Exactly.
And he's a smart guy. He could say that. But he's trying to fool people into thinking that the population is declining, which, by the way, would be good news. We need it to decline for a while. But shame on Mitt Romney.
Well, and I don't think he's the only political leader. I mean, I guess he's less of a national leader in the U.S. these days, but I think in Iran is a place that you've brought up where they've started trying to grow the birth rate.
And that's after they had a phenomenally successful program to get the fertility rate way down.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. And again, leaders there talk as if the population is shrinking when in fact it's been growing. It's just not growing as fast as it did 20 years ago. According to the UN, Iran is on track to increase its population in the next 3 decades from 85 to 105 million.
And yet there are still some reasons that there are people out there who think that we need these policies to make it more affordable or more convenient for people to be parents, right?
I think that's true. And as you say, a lot of that's driven by a pro-growth economic approach. Some of it, though, is driven by something that's more reasonable, and that's that, for many people, having a child, having a family is part of their life plan and really a reasonable goal in life. And it makes sense then for our societies to try to facilitate that. So there are some positive reasons for some of these policies as well.
Yeah, and I think what I want to do in this episode is really shake things up about that, because we've got this long-standing, I don't know, what do you call it? It's a norm, it's a paradigm, this long-standing sense that, getting married, starting a family, having a house, that is situation normal. It's the American dream. It's the dream around the world for a lot of people, and that we owe people the ability to do that. And I wonder whether that is obsolete today. And part of the reason I wonder why it's obsolete is because we definitely know today that if a lot of people live that particular dream, that nobody will get to have the dream. because we'll basically drive human civilization off a cliff.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting side effect of exponential growth, because I don't think that this was an issue 50 years ago when the population was, around 3.5 billion. We've grown so quickly in such a short amount of time that the societal norms and the kind of that legacy that we've inherited of what's a normal family look like, what's a normal life trajectory and expectations, that has to change because we are in overshoot, but it's come up upon us really quickly, and our society hasn't quite figured that out yet, how to make that shift. And that's because of exponential growth. It's happened so rapidly in the last 50 years that we've really gotten to this point.
Yeah, and Phil, I don't know whether we're ambushing you with this thoughts that obviously Stephanie and I share, and I'm glad to hear that you and I are thinking a lot alike. But I think I kind of raced ahead a little bit, and let me back up a little bit and finish setting the table. On that table in the U.S. today, all these are in the Build Back Better Act that was passed by the House of Representatives in November of 2021, but it is stalled now and not going to probably even be up for a vote in the Senate. So people are trying to figure out, okay, how can we somehow get these wonderful public policies extended? There's 3 of them on my list. One is reinstating the expanded child tax credit that was expanded during the COVID pandemic, the early days. One is paid family and medical leave, more of that, more guarantees of that. And then another one is subsidized child care and universal pre-K, which is a form of subsidized child care too. Those are 3 public policies that it almost seems, Phil, doesn't it seem like there's almost universal agreement out there that, of course, those are wonderful. We need those.
I wouldn't say it's almost universal, because there are people, especially on the conservative side of the spectrum, who are concerned about the overall cost of those things.
True, yeah.
So probably no one will say any of those are bad things in themselves, but they might well say, well, we can't afford them, or we can't afford them now. But I think you're right. From the poll numbers that I've seen, all of those are popular with a majority of Americans. And so the question, I guess, is for those of us who are both politically progressive and want to help poor people and working class people live better lives, and who are also environmentally concerned and especially concerned about overpopulation, how do we want to think about those kind of policies?
Yeah, well put, because nobody's for child poverty, right?
Right. And I think we would all agree that for existing children on the planet, those children deserve a high quality of life, and we don't want any of those children to be in poverty. But the problem is when it incentivizes, these policies incentivize people having more children, where we have to, I think that's the part of the conversation, right, that we want to dive deeper into.
Well, I think that's part of it. One is definitely that you have to ask the question, does it incentivize? And if it does incentivize having children earlier or having more children, then that's a problem in today's situation. But the other one is, does it send the wrong signal? Does it signal that it's a wonderful thing? Having children, and the more the better, is a societal virtue.
Yeah, I think in either case, what you're talking about are incentivizing and signalizing and validating behavior. To some degree, this is a problem that will never find a perfect solution.
Oh, darn.
Because having children, is a wonderful thing. But we've reached a point now where we're so deep into overshoot, as you say, that really to create sustainable societies, which is going to be a multi-generational task, we are going to have much smaller populations. So, the first step you have to have in asking these kind of questions is, are people on board with the need to create sustainable societies? And then are they on board with the idea that to create sustainable societies, we're going to have fewer people? If you agree with those two statements, then you start to look at these issues in a much more focused way. But let's back up for a moment. Most of our fellow citizens don't necessarily agree with either of those statements. I mean, if you poll people, they'll say, of course, we want sustainability. But it's a very nebulous issue, and it's not typically connected up with giving anything up. And so really, most Americans are not committed to sustainability. But even those who are, even those who think about these issues, don't typically tie them into the size of our population. So right off the bat, we're sort of asking, if we had a much clearer understanding of those things, what would the policy be? But then if you turn around and try to discuss this with your fellow citizens, I think you'll find very quickly that they're really not on the same page.
Right. They haven't gotten past the basics.
Yeah.
The basic understanding that is necessary to start asking this question.
So, if you take a look at some of what researchers have said in recent years about what a sustainable global population might look like, it's interesting that quite often you come up with a number between 2 and 3 billion. So Chris Tucker with his Planet of 3 billion came out in 2019. Partha Dasgupta with his Population Ethics for a Diminishing Planet. Other researchers as well have consistently said we can at least imagine 2 to 3 billion people being sustainable. Now, if you imagine the population of the United States decreasing by a somewhat similar percentage, you're talking about moving from 330 million people to perhaps somewhere between 100 and 150 million people. In order to achieve that in 2 to 4 generations, we really have to start creating norms of one-child families. And as near as I can understand the science of all this, that's really what we need to create sustainable societies. So when I start asking, well, what would be reasonable population policies, I'm asking what kind of policies could get us to 100 to 150 million Americans in a couple generations, doing the least to harm people's interests. That's how I look at the question.
I really like that framing. And I when I was grappling with this topic leading up to our recording session today, I think I sort of did a similar thing where I thought about, well, what does the ideal society look like? And so I sort of had this vision for an ideal society as one in which everyone has access to and can afford birth control. It's culturally, politically desirable to want no children or one child. That's the norm and becomes the sort of average fertility that, people are kind of arranged around.
Right.
And for folks that do have a child, there's adequate care for that child. They have enough nutrition, clothing, healthcare, daycare, preschool, access to sports, etc., and educational opportunities for the child throughout their life. So there's kind of a balance of both sides of the equation of quantity is reasonable and quality is high. The quality of life is very high for the children that we do have. So that's the ideal that I have in my mind. And then, Phil, I'm really curious for us to get into this conversation around maybe like what are the policies that we could have in place, or at least how do the policies that are in place now not serve that ideal vision of where we want to go?
Let's talk about one of the policies that is in the Build Back Better Act that Dave just mentioned, and that's the expanded child tax credit. The child tax credit in 2020 was $2,000, I believe. The American Rescue Plan, enacted in March 2021, expanded that. Okay, it expanded the child tax credit to $3,000 with a $600 bonus for kids under the age of 6. Okay, so that was pretty straightforwardly an effort to stimulate the economy, get more money to people who might be out of work and who are needing to take care of their children. It made a certain amount of sense. And we've had child tax credits for a long time in this country. The idea has been that we want to facilitate people's ability to have children who are going to be the workers and taxpayers of the future. And the idea has also been we are happy with lots of children because we want a growing economy. Well, if you are now desirous of decreasing the overall population, it would make sense to do something like this. Let's have a child tax credit, even an expanded child tax credit, a generous child tax credit, but only for the first child that a couple might have. Then we are saying very clearly as a society, we want to support you in your effort to raise your child, but we need as a society to decrease our population. Now, what do you then say to people who have 2, 3, 4 kids? What you say is, well, look, you can do that, but we're not going to incentivize it and we're not going to support it because we've decided as a society that we need to shrink our numbers gradually, not continue to increase them. What do you think of that as a suggestion?
I think you're on the right track. And I want to go back to the very beginning of the track that you started taking us down, and that is this notion that we got the child tax credit because we wanted people to have lots of children. We needed lots of workers in this economy. And I was curious. I hadn't had a chance to dig and go try to find out, is that why we started the child tax credit to begin with? Maybe you've researched that and you know that, or maybe you're assuming that's the case. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd like to know the question and a little bit more of the history of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I do know that for the past 50 or 60 years, a child tax credit along these lines has existed in the United States. And I do know that it's similar tax credits are very common in other societies. And to be fair, it's not just about building up the endless growth economy. I mean, it makes sense to people that our government would facilitate our efforts to raise children. I mean, after all, when do you typically raise children? You do that quite often early on in a marriage. You do it when you don't have as much money as you might have a few decades later. And so it makes perfect sense to say, well, we as a society, we want to reproduce ourselves and we want to support our fellow citizens, in many cases our fellow family members who are trying to do that. So it's not as if it's a nefarious thing that we're doing to try to help make it a little easier for people to have kids. And then you add in the fact that over the past half a century or so, we've added something new into the mix, the idea that women as well as men are going to have careers and often be working in the monetary economy. So they're no longer going to be focused on raising children primarily, let's say. So now things like the child tax credit, child care subsidies, family leave, etc., providing those is really part of creating a more egalitarian society. And that's something that again, many of us will support.
Now, this feels really nice, but there are a lot of things that people do when they're young and before they're more well off, I guess, in older age, although the future economy, who knows what that's going to really look like. But, they do more skiing. They might ride all-terrain vehicles more when they're younger. They might go four-wheeling. They might travel the world. They might take more transatlantic flights when they're younger. And yet none of those things do we feel like our government owes them some kind of support so that they can do that. And yet having a baby is different. Is it different? Clearly it is, but should it be?
Well, I think it is. I think it is. I mean, I'm a skier, and I just got back from a few days at Crested Butte, which was very enjoyable. Comparing that or going four-wheeling to having children, I don't think most people build their lives and say, going skiing is going to be an essential part of my life. Going four-wheeling. Some people say traveling can be pretty important to me. But even there, most of us, that would definitely take a back seat to something like having a long-term relationship and raising a family. If you talk to people about their goals in life, or if you ask people to look back on what was essential in the life that they lived, having children is often a part of that. And because it's also something that we need to do to, again, reproduce our society, it makes a lot of sense to say government is going to treat that as something special. And if we didn't have this environmental problem that we so obviously have, we could just leave it at that. We could work to create generous governmental supports for people to have families. The problem is we're really looking at a situation where one or two generations down the line, young people might not have the opportunity to raise any children safely and securely. And so for me, this is really the strongest argument for trying to find some kind of a balance in all this.
Well, that's the first sensible thing you've said in 5 minutes, Phil.
All right, there you go. Everyone's for balance, right? How can you be against balance?
Yeah, and I'm just kind of kidding because you're very sensible, but I definitely want to push back. But I'm hoping Stephanie will take you to task for some of what you said.
Yeah, you're just listening to us old guys talking.
I think I'm leaning toward agreeing with what Phil said. I mean, there is this biological imperative that I think we're all under the influence of, but that also has to coexist with other factors. And right now, my generation is coming, face to face with overshoot and what that looks like, and what in my lifetime are going to be the big challenges that many people are going to be facing, and then what that means for our choices for future generations. We're really, I think, coming to a head on this topic. And so we need to, I think, start thinking about it in a little bit of a different way than we have in the past. I don't think that we can just assume that everyone's goal should or could or will be to have a family. Obviously, we don't all want to stop having children because we would die out completely if no more children were born ever. I don't think that's a reasonable path. We have to find some sort of middle ground that gets us on the right track and gets us to a good level. But I think children are desirable. I don't think that they're going to stop being desirable, but it has to be at the right levels.
Well, I get it, and I don't argue with you about the policy adjustment, but I do want to argue a little bit about some of the philosophy behind it. Here's a really good example. I'll really be interested in both of your thoughts on this. Today, everyone knows that there are a number of challenges facing a woman who wants to have a career. There are barriers to becoming a parent or for a woman to have a successful career without sacrificing motherhood, because childcare is expensive, paid family leave isn't universal or is inadequate. Women who have children they get penalized in their career because they have to devote more time to their family than someone who doesn't have children, and that could take them away from the office. It could make them less available, and raising children is expensive in general. So it's harder for women because they have that nurturing instinct, I guess, so they end up more often than not bearing the brunt of the time commitments. Men aren't penalized as often in their careers for having children as women are. And that's not fair, and that's not right. But you could say that it's hard for women to advance in their career and be marathon runners, because that takes time and that takes money. But we don't feel this need to change public policy so that women can run marathons and advance in their careers. But we do so that they can be mothers and advance in their careers. And Phil, you explained why, but I'm just not sure I'm buying that. Should it have a special place where we all say, you know what, we're all going to pitch in. We're all going to put money in the plate. Let's pass the basket.
I think it should.
Yeah?
I think it should.
Why?
Well, I think it should because you're talking about a fundamental human interest. And, the fundamental human interests, I think it's a relatively short list, but I think for many people, being able to reproduce and have the experience of having a child, raising that child, having an intergenerational experience which continues on, I just think that rises. You could look at it different ways. You could say it's a fundamental part of being a human being, And I think you can make a case for that. Although I think childless people don't stop being human beings because they don't raise a child.
Yeah.
But I think you can also look at it and say, well, again, it's on a very short list of things that most people want very strongly to do in their lives. Marathon running is not on that list. Some other things that might be on that list, in the United States at least, making a lot of money might be on that list for a lot of people.
Exactly.
but I don't think we really owe the same government commitment to that, because I think you can live a perfectly good life without a ton of money.
But you can live a perfectly good life without having children.
Well, that's true. And I think one of the answers to this problem that we have here is we need to articulate that and make that a lot more of a social norm. It needs to be much more accepted. People, choosing not to have kids for whatever reason, but we need to pat them on the back for environmental reasons as well. And that should be seen as a wonderful contribution to sustainability, I think. But even having said that, when it comes down to it, most men and women, they want to have a family. And I think there's a way for us to facilitate that through good public policy, while also modeling and incentivizing one-child norms. I think that's the path forward. Because, look, even just working to stabilize our current population, I don't think is going to enable us to create sustainable societies.
Yeah.
And again, when I talk to people about these kind of things, I often get a sense that in the background there's an idea that, well, maybe we can still deal with our environmental problems without having to go into all this. And, I just think that is a terrible misconception. People don't understand that their grandkids could be looking at a really dreadful future unless we start to get our numbers and our economic system into better balance.
Yeah, I think I'm agreeing with Phil on these topics, Dad, but I'm glad that you're asking those hard questions, because I think it helps us really think hard about why we feel this way. And it's not just an expectation, it's all of the lovely things that come with having a family, and we want to preserve those things, but we also need that to exist in a healthy ecosystem and with other species on the planet. So we have to find the answer. Related just to what you were just talking about, Phil. So Travis Reeder, who wrote Toward a Small Family Ethic: How Overpopulation and Climate Change Are Affecting the Morality of Procreation. Dad, you interviewed him for the Conversation Earth podcast series. Mm-hmm. And I listened to that episode recently. And he said, in his experience, it's been easier to get people to give up having a larger family than to give up their stuff. And so, when we think about the consumption side of the equation and the number of people side of the equation, Phil, you were just saying, you don't have confidence or faith that we can reduce our consumption enough so that we don't have to do anything to the population side of the equation. And I think Travis's comment on that is similar.
Yeah.
People would rather give up family than their stuff.
Well, and I mean, we would have to give up an extraordinary amount of stuff. But even if we just had to cut our stuff in half, we're not willing to do that.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because we'll put a link in the show notes to Travis's book, which unfortunately is a little bit on the expensive side. We'll put a link in the show notes to that episode of Conversation Earth. And you're probably leading up to, before I interrupted you, that, well, you didn't get a chance to read the book. And in the book, he's an ethicist and a philosophy professor, and he goes through a lot of gyrations in this book to try to figure out what's the moral responsibility. And he finally, I think, ends up arriving at, well, it's pretty easy to make the case that it might be your responsibility not to have 2 or 3 or 4 kids, being an overshoot today. But it's a lot harder to make the case that you should have 0. That there's a pretty strong case for people to want and deserve to have the experience of being a parent and having one child. And I think that's just right where you are, Phil.
Yeah, and it seems to be where a lot of environmental philosophers are coming out. Sarah Conley published a book, I think, in 2016, where she argues for something similar. She argues in terms of rights, and she argues both in terms of bodily autonomy and in terms of a right to pursue reasonable life plans, that mature adults who have the wherewithal to take care of a kid have a right to have one child, and governments should support them in that. But then she asks, well, do you have a right, an unlimited right, or a right to have many children? And she says, well, in other circumstances, you might. But in the circumstance that we're in, where we're in overshoot, no, she doesn't think people have that right. And therefore, she believes governments should enact policies which will stabilize or, even better, reduce populations.
We'll put a link in the show notes there, too.
By the way, I just want to add one thing. So, if we're coalescing around this kind of an idea, a right to have one kid, but not necessarily a right to have more, it's very important, assuming for the moment now that our society might follow us in this and come to a similar conclusion. We're a long way from that. But let's say they did. I think it would be very important then to try to design policies that don't, like so many of our policies, punish poor people and let rich people get away with doing whatever they want. I think there's an argument to be made if you're going to limit the child tax credit to one child, for instance. For wealthy people, you might want to have fines for having extra children. Now, again, you probably wouldn't want to do that for middle class or working class families, because you don't want to drive people into poverty and punish children. But, if this is something that we should be committing to as a society, we need to have rich people commit to it too.
Well, darn. There you go, because the rich people, they own our legislators, Phil. So
I've noticed that.
That's going to be a tough one.
Yeah. And they also want poor people to keep having lots of kids so they can have more consumers and flooded labor markets. So
you notice that.
That's a whole other issue.
Yeah. And, there's another challenge in making the transition to this kind of policy where you're taking away some support for second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth children. The potential there is for existing children to be underfed and underclothed and impoverished if they lose some of those benefits.
Yeah, and that is something, and what that means again is that even if we want to incentivize one-child families, there are going to be limits to the just policies that might do that. So I would be relatively comfortable saying, okay, the child tax credit for the first child, but not for future children. But there are other benefits that society provides to children that I wouldn't want to see limited. I wouldn't want to see school lunch programs limited to just the first child. I wouldn't want free primary and secondary care limited in any way, for just the reason that you say. We can't punish and impoverish children. We have to avoid that.
But there are a lot of ways that we socialize the cost of raising a child. And what made me think of that was public education, the cost of educating your children. And I think that's a question. I get it. I understand that we do not want to punish any of the children on the face of the planet. But we've got to somehow navigate this tricky course to where we eliminate as many of the incentives as possible and as many of the signals as possible that say, we want you to go forth and multiply.
Dave, don't you want a grandchild?
The truth is, I feel like I don't. I feel like I have to give that up so that some other people's grandchildren can have a shot at a decent life. I think it's a temporary condition that we're in.
Yeah. Well, don't listen to him, Stephanie.
The damage might already be done.
All right, we're going to have to edit that out.
No, this has been such an interesting topic because I'm 33. I'm about to get married. have obviously been having these sorts of conversations with my partner about what do we want our family to look like. And we talk so much about exactly what we've been talking about here today. What is the impact? Can we justify having one child, or, would it be better for us to make the choice to have no children, and what would our life look like? And this is something that I think everyone needs to start grappling with and having those types of conversations and thinking much more beyond themselves.
Do you think a lot of your friends have similar discussions and questions?
Not nearly enough. No, I don't. I don't get the sense that they have connected the dots on that.
I see.
Unfortunately,
because you do hear more about this. You hear about birth strikes and younger people in Europe and in the United States who, at least they say, well, I'm going to not have a child either because I'm worried about contributing to all these problems, or they're worried that the child is going to be coming into a world which again might not be safe and secure.
And let's just say, I think the three of us are reading about this subject and talking about this subject a lot, so we have a tendency to sort of assume knowledge on the part of our listeners that may or may not be there, depending on who happened to find this episode of the Growth Busters podcast. When we're talking about a one-child norm, it's something that we need for a while. We need to have a one-child norm long enough to get from today's almost 8 billion down to 1 or 2 or 3 billion, depending on whose math you're going by. And, we don't need to argue about that until we get close to that number.
Exactly.
We know which direction we need, but eventually we'll want a stable population, and then it'll be a 2-child norm.
Yep.
That's right. I feel very positive in this for a number of reasons about this. I mean, you can get kind of discouraged looking into these issues. But, we do have examples from various parts of the world, primarily Europe and the Far East, of societies where fertility rates are way down. In some cases, population numbers have started to go down, and the sky hasn't fallen. So, at least so far, countries seem to be able to deal with declining populations. So I see that as very hopeful. And then I also see it as hopeful that so many families that I know have one child, and it can be a very nice lifestyle. It works out for the children involved. Often, people wonder, well, are only children very selfish and self-centered, or do they miss having siblings? And, there are ways to get only children together with other children and have it work very nicely. So again, there are positive aspects to this looking forward.
You both remind me that Pope Francis recently made a point poorly and was, I think, roundly chastised around the planet for saying this, that couples who are having pets instead of children are really selfish, and shame on them. They really need to start making babies. And, I've always kind of felt like when we're so deep into overshoot, I kind of felt like, we really need to give up pets too. That's kind of a luxury, and there is a footprint. But you know what? The footprint of a pet is a whole lot less than the footprint of a child. So, Stephanie, if you want to give me a grand dog instead of a grandchild.
Yeah, you'd watch the dog if
I
we
might
wanted to drop the dog off for a weekend.
I'm not crazy about dog sitting, but yeah, I would do that.
Good to know.
But I would also, if you decide to have one child, I would babysit. And you know what? If you decided to have 3 or 4, I wouldn't disown you because I love you, but I might not respect you as much.
Well, I think I've already told you this, Dad, that we've decided to have at most one, and still trying to decide if we even want to have one child. So,
well, don't talk to Phil too long because he might talk.
Yeah, he's going to convince me.
Stephanie, it's a lot of fun to go snowboarding with them.
That sounds great. The good news is that, and I think, Phil, you've written about this in some of your articles, is that a big first step that's affordable, doable today, is just providing women and families all over the planet with contraceptives.
Absolutely.
Affordable, available contraceptives. And that will go a long way toward achieving the goals that we're talking about here today. And that is so palatable. And it also moves forward women's rights, women's ability to do what they want to do, have a career, get an education, if they're not tied down with just child rearing. So can we get everyone on board with just that very basic, easy, affordable step as a first thing?
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, and it deserves to be reiterated. There's an awful lot we can do in these sort of win-win situations by getting women and couples the family planning information, the cheap or free contraception. That can go a long way towards decreasing fertility rates. I mean, we have good evidence from many countries around the world that when that is done, women and couples wind up having between 1 and 2 children on average.
Well, wait. I got to take exception to that, because that's going to signal to people that they should have lots of sex, just not lots of children.
Well, they should.
Oh, wait a minute. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
I just got so used to playing the hard ass, I thought I'd be a hard ass about this too. But this is really good. This is good public policy.
We don't want to lose sight of those win-win aspects of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think traditionally the concept of population control has been a taboo topic. Have you noticed a change in that, Phil, in the last 10 years? Do you think that environmentalists, climate scientists, people, our world leaders that are having these conversations within the UN and at the different climate conferences, is this topic starting to become more palatable and coming to the fore, or are we still a ways away from that in your experience?
I think we're making good progress, especially in the last 10 years or so. When I compare, well, on a number of levels, I mean, I see a much greater willingness among my students at Colorado State University to discuss limits to growth, population decline as a positive thing, degrowth economics, all of these sorts of issues. I see much more discussion about that in the scientific literature, which is interesting. There was I think it was about 2.5 years or so ago, there was a world scientist's warning of a climate emergency. It came out in 2019, I believe, Bill Ripple and others. Mm-hmm. And it was signed by over 12,000 scientists around the world. And in this warning, they stated very clearly that stabilizing and ideally decreasing population was an important part of dealing with climate change. So, that is just a huge change from 10 years ago. So the scientists are talking about it. Some of the policy analysts are talking about it. Where I'm not seeing realistic discussions about population yet are in the global fora like the IPCC annual meetings.
Yeah.
You don't see much of it making its way into discussions by political leaders. But I think that's coming. And it's not because people are getting any more open-minded about the issue or any more likely to stick their heads in the sand. I think it's becoming blindingly obvious that what we're doing isn't working. I mean, at some point, it just becomes impossible to pretend anymore. Mm-hmm, and I think we're reaching that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right when it's getting to be too late.
Yep.
It's blindingly obvious. Hey, listen, I think we had the conversation that we wanted to have.
Yeah, Phil, it's been really lovely to speak with you. And I just really enjoyed reading your articles.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Stephanie.
And I'm going to send them around to some of my friends, too.
Wonderful.
So thank you so much for your work on this topic and publishing that.
Yeah, it's great meeting you. And Dave, it's great seeing you again.
Phil, I love you to death. I hope you'll still talk to me after I was so hard on you in this episode. But it looks like you won the debate, if there was a debate, and if there's a winner and a loser. But I felt like somebody had to really take this hard position that may be right. Who knows? I'm not sure. But you two made a pretty good case, so congratulations for that.
Sounds good.
We will put links in the show notes to the Overpopulation Project and to some of the other things that you've written,
Great.
Phil, so that people can better explore your work, because you're in the bucket of the smartest people on the planet on the subject of sustainability. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, and thanks for all your work, Dave.
So I guess we're starting a new segment here.
This might have to be a regular one.
It might be a good idea, and we're calling it I Wish I Had Said That. We're back in the studio because there were a few things we each found we wish we had said when we recorded this episode with Phil Cafaro, and so here we are to correct the record.
Or add to the record.
Yes. So I'll go first with one. I thought of a better way to be the hard ass I was trying to be about this subject. And I want to say, let me just offer a disclaimer. I don't think I have all the answers. I just think I have some really important questions to ask in this episode. But here's a challenge I wish I had worded this way. If you want to be on the fast track to become a top executive, and you want to have a child, but you don't want to have to take time off for full-time parenting, do I owe it to you to pitch in some tax dollars to make childcare more affordable to you?
That's a great question.
And I'm glad to ask it now that Phil's not here to give his, warm-hearted answer to that.
So the thing that I wanted to add was in regards to a conversation about if I personally was going to have a child or not. And we kind of talked about you being a grandparent and whether you wanted a grandchild or not. And I just wanted to add that it's been really great in my own life to not have that pressure from you. You've always made it really clear that if I decide to have a kid, great. If I don't have a kid, great.
Yeah.
And you are very supportive of that decision. And it's just been really cool to not have this pressure from my parents during my life to start making babies. And that's been really great.
I think that's really important, and I think there aren't that many people who can say that, unfortunately.
No, and I think it's much more common for you when you get engaged or married. The next question that people ask is, "Oh, when are you going to have kids?" And I think we really need to start changing that very quickly.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. It came up when I was listening to music in the gym the other day. Carly Simon, That's the Way I've Always Heard It Should Be. Do you remember that song?
I don't think I know that one.
But you say it's time we moved in together and raised a family of our own, you and me. Well, that's the way I've always heard it should be. You want to marry me.
Well, it needs to stop being That's the Way I've Always Heard It Should Be. There should be a lot more options on the menu.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, two other things I wanted to quickly say. One is that I mentioned Mitt Romney and gave him some grief, well-deserved, I think, for being deceptive. But I also forgive him for being uninformed a little bit. But it's important that he be informed. And I think it's incredibly important that people like Mitt Romney, that senators, representatives, presidents, governors, prime ministers, cabinet members, all the policymakers around the world, they all need to understand that we are in overshoot as they formulate all kinds of public policy, especially public policy that might affect birth rates and public policy that might affect consumption and economic growth. And I actually wrote a piece about this subject recently, published on the Ending Overshoot publication on Medium, titled Insist That Public Policy Respects the Rights of Children and Women. And we didn't ever really articulate this in the episode, but I think the children of the future, they have a right to be born into a decent world where they have a shot at a decent life. And if we all have as many children as Mitt Romney wants us to have, then the children of the future do not get that.
Yep. There's sort of an intergenerational equity question involved, and I think current people on the planet, we all deserve to have a livable planet. And your decision around family size impacts others. There's no way around that fact. And so we all need to be a lot more intentional about what we're doing.
Yeah, to say nothing of the rights of nature as well.
Yep, and other species.
All right, anything else?
No, I think we might want to revive this one for future discussions. I think that a I wish I had said type segment will be helpful because we do talk about some really interesting topics, and some of them deserve follow-up. Some of them deserve a little more thinking after the fact and revisiting. So I'm glad we're doing this.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks, Dad.
Well, you and Phil really ganged up on me, Steph.
Yep, I'm afraid we did.
Don't let that happen again.
No promises there.
All right. Well, we're going to skip Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint this time because we got so much good listener feedback and we want to devote more time to that, right?
Yeah, we've got some really interesting topics to hear and probably do a little bit of discussion after we listen to some of these.
That's right. We get to listen to them, don't we?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you had the idea to do a call-in line.
It was brilliant. We got a lot of emails and we got some voicemails, almost all in response to our last episode, Stuck in Traffic, Head to Mars, where we roasted Elon Musk. I'll put a link in the show notes in case you've missed that episode. So anyway, we had 3 good messages recorded on our new feedback line, and if you want to hear yourself on the Growth Busters podcast, you can call and leave a message. Call 719-402-1400.
Yeah, so let's listen to the first message we got.
Hi, Dave and Stephanie. This is Lee Badger. I just wanted to tell you about my approval of your latest, I think it was your latest podcast, 63, Stuck in Traffic, Head to Mars. And yeah, there's something really self-serving about Elon Musk telling us that we really got to increase the population because he stands to be one of the largest beneficiaries of that. So I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, he thinks that the whole space is his. You remember he sent his first Tesla pushed it into outer space and thereby expanding our human garbage dump by a considerable amount. So I don't know if there's any way to rein him in. I hope the Chinese can, because I guess his Starlink system is beginning to threaten their space station. I wanted to mention about Dave's wife who talked about, well, if we don't book those flights, does that mean the flight won't fly? And there's something I see that's kind of similar between holding or not flying and voting. Both behaviors, you kind of need a lot of people to take that stance in order to make a difference. But at least with most of the people I look at, they're very adamant about how you must go out and vote. Everybody's got to vote. But they're not so adamant about the fact that really we ought to keep it in the ground and not fly so much.
Yeah, so I think Lee does have a good point that there has to be some sort of cultural norm and advocacy of, this is our duty. This is something that we need to do as citizens. But if the number of voters we get is any indication of our likely success at getting people to curb their flying, I'm a little worried because we don't have a good voter turnout. And how are we going to get people to stop flying?
Well, I was glad he brought that up because it is a great analogy. Because if you're sitting at home deciding whether or not to vote, and you're thinking it's a lot of trouble, well, everybody else is going to vote. My single vote isn't going to make a difference. Or it's the same thing. If you're sitting at home thinking, I'm not going to take the bus to work, or I'm not going to ride my bicycle to work, I'll let other people be more responsible about their carbon footprint. If I change my behavior, that's just me. What difference is that going to make? But if there are millions or even billions of people thinking exactly like you, what we want is we want everybody making the right choice. And that's big. And so if you're making that decision, you have to imagine you're pulling the lever for 1 million or 1 billion people. Because you are. If you're going to be selfish about it, probably 1 billion other people are going to be selfish about it. If you're going to be responsible about it, probably 1 billion other people are going to exercise similar responsibility.
So maybe we just need to get out of our own way on that one.
We got another great message from Terry Spar. He's the producer of the documentary 8 Billion Angels and founder of a great environmental nonprofit called Earth Overshoot. We'll put links in the show notes. Let's see what Terry had to say.
Hey, Dave and Stephanie, Terry Spar at Earth Overshoot. Love the call-in line. I just listened to your Elon Musk podcast, and Musk is a forceful personality, but that's about it. He's unquestionably not a genius. His views only orbit around his own little silo of companies that he's established and benefits from. His comments, Dave and Stephanie, that the greatest constraint to civilization is the availability of labor, and we need more babies to offset this labor shortage, just illustrates to me how, his deluded worldview of everything. He demonstrates not only, to me, one iota of wisdom to the constraints of the planet and civilization's almost 8 billion people who are unsustainably exploiting and drastically depleting its limited renewable and non-renewable natural resources, leaving in our wake a massively polluted and toxic landscape. To me, it's just sheer stupidity to advocate that more of us will improve the future health and welfare of humanity in the natural world. I think, to me, thanks to Musk's hubris, I, for one, will never buy a Tesla. So appreciate the call in line. I was frustrated to, hear those views of his, and, appreciate everything that you guys are doing.
I think that's great. It's never going to buy a Tesla.
Yep, I think many of us are way over Elon Musk. Let's move on.
Yeah, you didn't want to devote the last episode to that guy.
All right. The last call we received was a gentleman named Simon Cole, and he's with Sustainable Population Australia. So let's hear what he has to say.
Hello, Dave, and hello, Steph. Thanks for your episode on Elon Musk and his pronouncements that there aren't enough people in the world. It inspired me to dig deep into why he thinks that. And I wrote a piece. And the answer, I say, lies in Richard Heinberg's new book, Power, Limits to, what is it now? Anyway, essentially, he is blinded by his addiction to power and building. Thank you again for your episode. I'll send you a copy of it or a link to my website. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Simon. It's great to hear from you.
Yeah, great additional insights around, corporate executive power, self-interests, selling as many Teslas as possible. I mean, that's what Elon's all about. He's not about solving ecological overshoot.
We'll put links in the show notes to a few of the things Sustainable Population Australia, if you're interested in checking out that great organization, and a link to Simon's piece that he mentioned, and a link to Richard Heinberg's book, Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival. All
right. So we also got quite a few emails after the last episode. We got an email from Graham in Australia. He writes, "Good evening from down under, Dave. As I write this, I'm just listening to your podcast on Stuck in Traffic, Move to Mars. It's a bit perplexing how Elon Musk can be so ecologically illiterate. Pretty sad, really, as he has global media reach. His statements were followed by the death of E.O. Wilson, who is one of my real heroes. It seems Elon needs to do a deep dive into island biogeography, conservation biology, mass species extinction, and EO's half-Earth. I hope 2022 brings us a paradigm shift. Stay well in these strange times. Note, I thought you might be interested in this other latest info on Antarctic research." And he sent us a link about the ice shelf holding back Antarctica's glacier, Doomsday Glacier. So we'll include a link in the show notes. I did check out that article, and it's just more terrifying information about how we're drastically changing our world.
Thanks, Graham. Great to hear from you. Got a quick email from Ellen right here in Colorado. Elon Musk is an outrageous pick. I really thought at first that she wrote, Elon Musk is an outrageous prick.
Yeah, maybe that should have been a Freudian slip.
An outrageous pick for Person of the Year, but nothing new. Glad for your critique, though the people who need to be confronted are not likely listening. Sigh. Thanks, Ellen.
And then we have an email from Robert. I wonder if Elon Musk's interest in space travel might be informed by the fact that his cars require vast amounts of finite, non-renewable resources that are going to become more and more difficult to obtain. Perhaps he sees mining of asteroids as a solution, though I doubt that we're going to get that far. As for what Musk is thinking, this paragraph from my website might help. It is an innate problem with our species that human beings in general, and I should say politicians and corporate executives in particular, have the most amazing capacity for talking themselves into sincerely believing absolutely ridiculous shit when doing so happens to be convenient. This is how politicians and corporate executives can look at themselves in the mirror, genuinely believe that their behavior is acceptable, and then go about their day doing a grotesque disservice to future generations. It is a celebrated truism of the annoyingly named New Age spirituality movement that human consciousness must change for world peace and environmental sanity to prevail. But this idea isn't discussed in the mainstream discourse because it is viewed as being vague and abstract, better discussed by philosophers or psychologists. But there is nothing vague or abstract about the ignorance, denial, delusion, and in some cases, I should say, psychopathic behavior exhibited by those with their hands on the levers of power in the world. And we'll link to the whole essay that Robert sent in.
Thanks, Robert. Great to hear from you. And finally, an interesting email from Joshua Spodek, who's host of the podcast This Sustainable Life and an occasional contributor to the Growth Busters podcast. We love Joshua, so it's always great to hear from him. And here's what he wrote. I love the podcast, as always, but feel compelled to comment on one point. You keep calling avoiding flying and other polluting activities sacrifices that we have to balance, as if we give up something good in not flying for something bad in living sustainably. One flight brings you to a distant loved one. Flying in general leads you to live far from them in the first place. One flight brings you a business opportunity in a distant market. Flying in general forces businesses to compete against everyone, everywhere, all the time. After not flying long enough, that view, however common, sounds like calling not taking crack or heroin a sacrifice. It only looks like a sacrifice from the values of the system causing the problem. Speaking positively of flying and other polluting activities supports that system and is as inaccurate as calling heroin positive. It creates pleasure in the moment, but it leads to a destructive lifestyle with net less reward. Josh. Quick note about Joshua. He has a third TEDx talk that was recently published titled Don't Call Doof Food. Systemic change begins with personal change. It's a really great video. We'll put a link in the show notes. But I think we need to chat a little bit about his comments. Don't you think, Steph?
Yeah, I'm really glad that Joshua wrote about this and brought this to my attention. And I think that he has a really great point, especially in regards to the concept of the systemic part. You know, like we have gotten ourselves into this tangled mess because we haven't been living sustainably, and now we're dealing with the consequences of that. So I agree with him that if flying didn't exist, you know, maybe I, for one, wouldn't live so far away from my family. But I already do live far away from my family, and I miss them, and I wish I could see them a lot. And so, you know, for me personally, choosing not to fly because I'm trying to reduce my impact does feel like a sacrifice. But I probably wouldn't have gotten myself into this mess in the first place if I hadn't, you know, started flying when I was a teenager.
Yeah, growing up in that system.
So, you know, for me personally on my own journey, I do feel like I am making some sacrifices. I also feel like I'm learning some of the joys of living more slowly and more sustainably. I've been trying to do more road trips, for example, instead of, you know, flying great distances. And, you know, I need to start taking more trains, which would take even more time, but I could get to experience the country in a different way. So thanks for the great reminder to try and look at it from that point of view of discovering the positives of reducing your impact and having a more sustainable lifestyle. But sometimes it feels like a sacrifice to me, and that's just kind of part of my journey at this point. What do you think about this, Dad?
Well, I think it's a great reminder, and I am acutely aware of the importance of communicating about the joy of living sustainably, because mostly it is a joy, and most of the things that you give up actually turn out to not be so great. So I in a way, I thought, wow, Josh, were you listening to my podcast? Because I can't believe I did that. Because usually I try pretty hard not to present those things as sacrifices. But every now and then I probably slide a little bit. And I do acknowledge that most people think of it as a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice to not be able to jump in a gas-guzzling automobile and run down the street for some fast food when you're hungry, or jump in an airplane and fly to a wedding, to a soccer game, to a rock concert, to visit your parents. But it is a joy to find other ways to live more sustainably. Like you said, it's a joy to take a train. It's a joy for me to get on my bicycle instead of get in the car. Who knew? Never was crazy about bicycle seats, but...
Well, thanks again, Josh, for the good thoughts. And I haven't seen your TEDx talks, so I'm going to be adding that to my watch list.
One more thing. It's a joy to just have one child or none. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with your life if you're not a slave in the laundry room doing laundry for 6 kids.
That's a great point.
Just saying.
There's a really short one from Chris, who's a professor in New York, and he writes, I am benefiting from your work. The movie is assigned viewing for my human population course. And I think that this is a great example of, the crowdfunding campaign in October that allowed us to put the documentary on YouTube for free. This professor is able to take advantage of it. And quick reminder that we have a job opening for college campus outreach position so that we can get in front of more young people that really could benefit from the information we're trying to share.
That's right. So if you're interested in that part-time position, send an email to podcast@growthbusters.org. And if you want to hear your voice in listener feedback, you can call 719-402-1400 and share your thoughts. You can also send an email to podcast@growthbusters.org.
And as always, a reminder to check out the growthbusters.org homepage where you can donate or join our email list. And if you think this podcast is important, share it with the people you love or just people who need to learn about limits to growth and could become enlightened from the topics that we discuss. Subscribe, review, and rate. We really appreciate your engagement there.
I'd like to give a quick nod of thanks to Jake Fader for composing and producing the Growthbusters theme, and for Carlos Jones for lending his vocal talents. Thanks, Stephanie. Great episode.
Thanks, Dad. Talk to you next time.
So long.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.